The relentless November rain of the Pacific Northwest was less a downpour and more a persistent, cold needle, weaving itself through the thin, threadbare layers of Jessica Sanchez's coat. At 42, she was an architectural consultant, or at least, she had been a few years ago when the city skyline was her canvas and corporate boardrooms were her office. Now, the city knew her only as a phantom. Another piece of discarded refuse tucked into the shadowed alcoves of downtown Seattle. She sat huddled on the granite steps of the old St. Jude's Theater, a place she had once consulted on a multi-million-dollar renovation for. The irony, a heavy, bitter blanket. Jessica had been the visionary, the creative force, the one who translated complex client needs into breathtaking, functional blueprints. Mark Underson, her partner since college, had been the pragmatic face, the one who managed the money and negotiated the contracts. She had trusted him implicitly, viewing their partnership as a testament to lifelong loyalty. Stronger than any legal contract, that trust had been her undoing. 2.5 years ago, while she was immersed in a major design submission, Mark had liquidated the company's assets, funneled the profits through a chain of dummy corporations, and, utilizing a labyrinth of falsified signatures and digital trails, framed her for grand embezzlement. The subsequent lawsuit and public shaming had cost Jessica everything. Her reputation, her savings, her sleek apartment overlooking the Puget Sound. Her friends had dissolved, her identity evaporated, leaving behind a husk that merely existed from one sheltered corner to the next. Every morning, she retreated to the main branch of the public library, not just for the warmth that momentarily thawed her core, but for the comforting silence of the reference section. There, surrounded by the documented order of history and knowledge, she felt briefly anchored to a world that celebrated structure, logic, and integrity, qualities that had been ruthlessly extinguished in her own life. She shifted slightly on the cold stone, the movement sending a fresh shiver through her body. The small, stale piece of Danish pastry she'd saved from a dumpster dive that morning was her dinner. As she slowly chewed, the memory of her old life flashed, painfully bright. The scent of her former wife's lemon and ginger tea, the quiet hum of her personal drafting table, the sound of colleagues congratulating her on a successful pitch. Now, all that was left was the ambient noise of a callous city moving around her, ignoring her presence. She had become skilled at being invisible, a shadow deemed unworthy of eye contact or compassion. She didn't blame the city. She blamed only herself for the sheer, unbridled depth of her naive belief in Mark. He had convinced her that a simple handshake, sealed by 30 years of shared history, held more weight than a stack of notarized documents. It was a lesson learned in the harshest school of experience. A loud, jarring slam of a car door nearby broke her reverie. A sleek, obsidian-black luxury sedan, undoubtedly an expensive German model, had pulled up hastily to the curb, right near the corner where the old theater steps met the pavement. A man, dressed in an impeccably tailored cashmere coat, emerged, barking into his phone as he hurried toward the entrance of the adjacent finance building, likely late for a late-night negotiation. He was perhaps 50, his stride confident, his silhouette projecting an aura of effortless power. As he disappeared into the revolving glass doors, something dark and substantial caught the minimal light near the car's rear tire. Jessica, driven by a flicker of instinct she hadn't felt in months, slowly rose and approached. It was a wallet made of expensive, heavily grained crocodile leather. It was thick, practically bursting with contents. Her heart, long dormant, kicked into a frantic Anavan rhythm. She knelt, her trembling fingers lifting the object. It was heavy. Inside, the money was stacked in crisp, consecutive $100 bills, totaling close to $4,800, far more cash than she had ever carried in her Apex Designs days. Beside the cash lay a row of platinum and black credit cards, each indicating a virtually limitless line of credit. Tucked into the clear plastic sleeve was a business card printed on thick. Pearl white stock, Mark Anderson, CEO, Meridian Holdings. Jessica's vision momentarily blurred. Meridian Holdings, the new name for their old company. The empire built on the rubble of her career and integrity. Fate, in its cruel, theatrical way, had decided to play one final, malicious trick. The architect in her registered the irony. The ultimate betrayal had led her to a literal foundation of money, placed at her feet by the betrayer himself. She retreated back to her cold corner, the the wallet burning a hole in the inside pocket of her coat. Her mind immediately fractured into two warring factions. The first voice, primal and bitter, screamed, "Take it. This is justice. This is compensation for the 2 years of misery, for the cold, the hunger, the shame. He owes you this and infinitely more. This money is your ticket out of smart apartment, real food, a chance to rebuild your life before the winter truly sets in." This was the voice of the desperate survivor. The second voice, quieter but resonating with the residual strength of the person she once was, replied, "If you take this, you become him. You cross the line of honor and integrity that he obliterated. You lose the last thing he couldn't steal, your own soul." Hours passed, the rain intensified, and the internal battle raged. She sat utterly still, the cold penetrating her to the bone, but the cold of decision was far more profound. As the city lights began to dim with the approach of midnight, Jessica knew what she had to do. She couldn't afford to be like Mark. She would not lose her selfhood. Clutching the heavy wallet and the business card with the address of the Meridian Holdings corporate headquarters, the Aurora tower, she slowly rose, turning her back on the theater steps, beginning a walk that felt like a return to the scene of a crime, only this time she was delivering an indictment. The Aurora Tower was a temple of polished steel and tinted glass, soaring into the inky urban sky, a monument to the very wealth and ambition that had devoured her. The sheer glass doors slid silently apart as she approached, welcoming her into a climate-controlled environment that immediately felt alien to her skin, used to the brutal indifference of the street. The air was thick with the faint scent of expensive, abstract cologne and new carpet. The security guard at the reception desk, a block of a man in a crisp uniform and a headset, assessed her instantly. The wet, frayed coat, the worn boots, the visible exhaustion etched around her eyes. His voice was flat, professional, and utterly dismissive. "I need to see Mark Anderson," Jessica stated, forcing her voice to be leveled, stripped of any hint of desperation or resentment. He asked, already shaking his head. "No, but I have something," he dropped. She reached into her coat and produced the crocodile wallet, its material gleaming obscenely under the recessed spotlights. The sight of the luxurious item in her dirty, chapped hand caused the guard to pause, his professional suspicion momentarily superseded by confusion. He made a quick, muffled call on his internal line. After a brief exchange, he pointed toward the express elevator banks. 45th floor. The door to the inner office, a thick slab of polished oak, finally opened, and Mark Anderson stepped out. He hadn't changed much. The same predatory confidence, the same expensive suit, the same smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Jessica." "Good God!" he chuckled, the surprise in his voice quickly curdling into an amused, condescending mockery. "Loki ATU. Still carrying that ridiculous portfolio, I see." Jessica ignored the provocation. She walked forward and placed the heavy wallet on the corner of his mahogany desk. "You dropped this near the St. Jude's Theater," she said, her voice steady. Mark picked up the wallet, flipped through the cash, checked the credit cards, his movements deliberate and performative. "Well, I'll be damned. The universe's greatest joke, perhaps. The architect of high ideals, living on the street, finds a fortune and returns it." He smirked, walking around his massive desk, circling her like a predator assessing wounded prey. "What is it you want, Jessica? A $20 bill? A bus pass? Surely you didn't do this for the sheer, naive pleasure of moral superiority." Jessica felt the bile rise in her throat, the words whipping like lashing rain. "I want nothing from you, Mark," she said firmly. "I simply refuse to let you drag me down to your level." Mark leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms. A picture of smug satiety. "Honor, right? I almost forgot about that. The one thing that keeps you warm at night. But fine. For your commendable, if totally idiotic, display of virtue, I will give you a little." Mark Anderson reached into the top drawer of his custom-built desk and, after rummaging through a tangle of keys for his security system and 2 sports cars, produced a small, tarnished brass ring holding only 2 heavy, rusted keys. He tossed the set onto the polished wood, where they landed with a clatter that was deafening in the silence of the luxurious office. "There, your reward," he announced, his smile chillingly devoid of genuine amusement. A tiny, secluded cabin up in the Cascade foot. about 180 miles east of here, near a forgotten mining settlement called Blackwood Creek. It was my mother's family's place of damn. Drafty shack I inherited and promptly forgot about. Frankly, I should have paid someone 30 years ago to burn it down. But you wanted a place to call your own, didn't you, Jessica? He picked up a silk handkerchief to wipe his fingers, as if touching the keys had contaminated him. It has 4 walls, a roof that probably leaks, and a wood stove. If you can make it, and if you can survive the winter in that desolate hole, you're welcome to it. A fresh start. If you can start now, get out. The keys felt ice-cold and heavy in Jessica's palm. They weren't just a physical gift. They were a symbol of utter contempt, a challenge designed to hasten her demise, not alleviate her suffering, a forgotten corner for a forgotten woman. She looked at Mark, and for the first time, the consuming hatred was momentarily replaced by a deep, weary pity. He was a creature utterly incapable of understanding true human connection or integrity. "You'll regret this, Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper, not as a threat, but as a prophecy. She turned, walked out of the office, and took the elevator down, the keys a lead weight in her pocket. The journey out of the city was slow, brutal, and humiliating. She spent her last $20 on a ticket for a cramped, decades-old Greyhound bus, which terminated its route in the nearest small town, over 30 miles from Blackwood Creek. The remaining distance had to be covered on foot. The landscape changed from towering glass and concrete to dense, unforgiving forests and bleak, winding dirt roads. The November air here was different. It was cleaner, colder, carrying the scent of pine, damp soil, and imminent snow. Her city-worn boots gave out completely within the first 20 miles. Forcing her to wrap her feet in plastic bags and discarded newspaper. Every kilometer was a battle against aching muscles and the certainty of frostbite. Her mind fueled only by a stubborn, irrational refusal to give up, to let Mark win this final, sadistic game. She held him to the fact that she was going to the unknown, not back to the misery of the familiar. After nearly 2 days of relentless trudging, guided by a barely legible, hand-drawn map given to her by a skeptical gas station attendant, she finally reached the periphery of Blackwood Creek. It was less a settlement and more a memory, a cluster of 7 or 8 collapsing structures, long since given up to the relentless march of nature. A few windows were shattered, doors hung askew, and the only signs of current life were the mournful cries of ravens circling overhead. She truly was at the edge of the world. The Anderson cabin was the last structure on the south side of what was once a muddy main road, distinguishable only by its slightly more durable, moss-covered log construction. It was deeply nestled in the trees, almost swallowed by the overgrown lot. The roof sagged ominously in the center. Several logs were soft with rot, and the front porch had completely collapsed. The spectacle was so profoundly desolate that for a second, a wave of true despair, colder than the weather, washed over her. Mark was right, a small voice hissed in her mind. You can't start. But then she gripped the portfolio tucked inside her coat, the drawings of impossible things she had made possible, and found a reserve of strength. She climbed the ruined steps, inserted the largest key into the enormous, rusty padlock on the heavy wooden door, and turned. The lock screamed in protest, but finally clicked open. Stepping inside, Jessica was hit by a suffocating combination of must, decay, mouse droppings, and the faint, unsettling scent of dried herbs. The main room was dark, the light barely filtering through the grime-caked windows. A huge stone hearth and chimney dominated one wall. Furniture was sparse, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a small cot in the corner piled with what looked like moth-eaten blankets. Yet, something was amiss. The layer of dust was thick over the table and floor, consistent with an abandoned home. But on the hearth near the chimney's mouth, there was a visible scattering of fresh soot, as if someone had recently attempted to start a fire. Furthermore, the cot wasn't simply a pile of rags. Under the moldy blankets, she could distinguish a newer, relatively clean woolen throw. And next to the cot, a chipped ceramic mug stood empty, but clean, devoid of the spider webs that clung to every other surface. Someone had been living here, or at least attempting to, very recently. A sense of unease settled over her, heavier than the cold. She dropped her bag and the precious portfolio onto the table. Exhaustion had reached a critical stage, her body shuddering uncontrollably from fatigue and the cold. Her first priority had to be fire. She found a small, dry cache of kindling near the back wall, presumably left by the previous occupant. After 30 minutes of coughing and tearing eyes from a chimney clogged with years of debris, she managed to coax the fire to life. The warmth, though minimal, was a salvation. She huddled by the stove, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger. Just as the heat began to spread its meager comfort, she heard a sound from the porch, a slow, shuffling footstep, followed by the metallic click of the latch. Jessica froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was alone, vulnerable, and deeply isolated. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, hunched figure illuminated by the firelight. It was an old woman. She appeared to be in her early 80s, frail, dressed in several layers of mismatched, faded clothing, her face a map of deep wrinkles, her eyes faded to a cloudy gray. She carried a small, antique kerosene lantern, its faint yellow glow casting dancing, nervous shadows on the walls. The voice was a thin, quavering whisper, but without fear, only a profound, weary surprise. "I am Jessica," she stammered, heaving slowly, her legs stiff. "I am the new owner." The old woman, as he hit, tilted her cloudy gaze, sweeping over Jessica's face, taking in her exhaustion, the grime, the deep-set anguish. "Marque," she murmured, a flicker of deep confusion crossing her features. Then, as the lantern lights shifted, illuminating Jessica's face fully, the old woman's expression transformed. The fatigue line seemed to momentarily soften, and her eyes suddenly focused, shining with a heartbreaking clarity. "Oh, my darling," she breathed, her voice cracking with pure, unrestrained emotion. "Sarah, you've come back." "I knew you would." Jessica stood petrified. Sarah, Mark's late wife, who had died in a tragic hiking accident several years before. She remembered the photos. Sarah was blonde, blue-eyed, and slightly taller, but perhaps under the dim light, or in the fragile state of the woman's mind, there was a resemblance. This was Mark Anderson's mother. The old woman took a halting step forward, her hand, brittle and trembling, reaching out. "They told me you were gone," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "But you're here." Jessica instinctively recoiled, a profound shock washing over her. "No, please," she tried to interject gently. "I'm not Sarah. My name is Jessica. I'm just..." But the old woman's mind, ravaged by advanced dementia, was immovable. "Don't say that, darling," she insisted, gently touching Jessica's wet sleeve. "I'm not well, but I remember my daughter. I remember your gentle face." The smell of jasmine had been Jessica's signature scent in her professional life. This was not simple confusion. This was the complete rewriting of reality by a broken mind. Jessica recalled Mark's cold words. "My mother lived there until ... He had explicitly given her the house because he believed his mother was dead. Yet here she was, living in squalor, abandoned not just by her son, but legally declared dead by him. The depth of Mark's cruelty, once abstract, was now vividly, heartbreakingly real. He hadn't just faked a death certificate. He had buried his mother alive in this remote shack, hoping the isolation would finish the job. The sheer malice of the act was staggering, surpassing even the corporate betrayal. And now Jessica was faced with an impossible choice. Reveal the devastating truth to this fragile woman, potentially shattering her last remaining illusion and hastening her decline, or play the role of the beloved returned daughter-in-law, a lie that would surely consume her. The old woman, Elling Anderson, Mark's mother, was already shuffling toward the hearth, her attention drawn to the fire. "Oh, you made a fire. Bless you," she cooed, her hands fluttering over the warm stones. "I've been trying all day, but I'm clumsy now. Sit, my dear. Tell me everything. Where have you been? I'll make us some stew. I have potatoes." Jessica watched Helen move with the slow, practiced movements of someone accustomed to long solitude. The raw, desperate hunger in her own stomach suddenly faded, replaced by a nauseating wave of responsibility. How could she leave? How could she shatter this woman's beautiful, protective delusion? Mark had intended this place to be her tomb, but fate had twisted it, making it the prison of her conscience instead. She was trapped between her own need for survival and the life of an innocent victim of Marquette's monstrous indifference. Taking a deep, ragged breath of the smoky air, Jessica made her decision. "It's a long story, Mama Helen," she said, using the name she'd heard Mark use in passing years ago. The use of the name felt like a betrayal, yet the old woman's face instantly lit up with such pure, boundless happiness that Jessica felt her carefully constructed shell of self-pity crack. "It's a very long story," she repeated, moving to gently take the kettle from Helen's hands. "But I'm home now." In that moment, Jessica Sanchez, the brilliant architect, became Sarah, the loving daughter-in-law, a role dictated by the unforgivable sin of her betrayer. She found herself fighting not for her own survival, but for the fragile sanity and life of the mother of the man she utterly despised. The weeks that followed settled into an exhausting, poignant blur of caregiving and makeshift renovation. She listened patiently to Helen's looping memories, recollections of Mark's childhood, stories of the original family farm that had been here, and confused fragments about Sarah's accident. Jessica would interject with details only she knew about Mark's career or his architectural tastes, seamlessly weaving fact into Helen's delusion. This fragile lie, a shield against devastating truth, was maintained only by constant vigilance. Jessica's initial resentment toward Mark had transformed into a cold, focused determination to keep his mother alive, purely out of spite for his malice. But as Helen's fragile warmth and occasional flashes of genuine maternal affection softened, that spite melted into a profound, protective connection. Using her expertise in architectural design and her practical problem-solving skills, Jessica began to salvage the cabin. She used scavenged sheet metal and tar paper left over from the long-dead mining operation to patch the most egregious leaks in the roof. She mixed mud and straw from the yard to fill the massive cracks in the logs, a technique she'd only read about in textbooks on sustainable, rustic building. Her hands, once accustomed to the precision of a digital stylus, were now a mass of calluses and blisters from splitting the dense DAMP pine logs Patrick had left near the property and scrubbing decades of grime from the windows. She spent hours rebuilding the ruined front porch, transforming it from a death trap into a stable entrance, working until she felt the healthy, muscle-deep ache of honest labor, a feeling she hadn't known since her career collapsed. Her days were entirely structured around Helen's needs, ensuring the fire was always lit, coaxing her to eat, and administering the meager over-the-counter medication Patrick had recommended. Helen's lucidity was unpredictable. One moment, she might be calmly describing the exact color of the peonies she planted in 1978. The next, she would be wailing, convinced that Mark had left her alone for 3 weeks while he was on a business trip, a period that, in her mind, had lasted years. Sometimes she would look at Jessica, and a flicker of true doubt would cross her eyes, as if the fog of dementia had momentarily thinned. "You're different, dear," she'd murmur. "Your eyes are darker than my Sarah's. You have the look of ... single." Jessica would simply hug her and distract her with the story about Marquez's latest fabricated success in the city. The deception was exhausting, but the knowledge that she was protecting an innocent life was the only thing that gave her a sense of purpose. It was a purpose bought at the price of the ultimate personal sacrifice, her own identity. The environment of Blackwood Creek was as harsh as the deception. The snows began light and persistent at first, then heavier, blanketing the clearing and making travel nearly impossible. Jessica's isolation was profound. Patrick Phillips, the retired firefighter who occasionally checked on Helen and left supplies, was her only human contact. He was skeptical but respectful, observing Jessica's relentless care with professional detachment. He knew Mark was a liar and a negligent son. He just didn't yet know the full extent of the architectural crime that had landed this elegant, city-worn woman in this desolate corner of the Cascades. Jessica, meanwhile, was slowly starving. She gave the lion's share of the canned food and dried beans to Helen, surviving mostly on thin broths and the sheer willpower to continue. She had lost nearly 25 pounds since leaving the city.